Mrs. Jyotsna Suri, Mr. Shah, Mr. Reddy, the CBDT chairperson, Mrs. Rani Singh Nair, other distinguished gentlemen on the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all thank both FICCI, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and all others for having organized this interaction on the IDS and the Gold Monetisation Scheme. The chairperson of the CBDT is here, and she's been trying to explain to you in details on some of the issues on which questions and issues and suggestions have been coming up. Since the 1st of June, the CBDT has shown a considerable amount of flexibility. They've been open to all kinds of suggestions, including those from the Institute of Chartered Accountants, from individual tax consultants, from other assessees which have come, and issued a series of FAQs in order to make sure that the scheme itself provides a sufficient clarification for people who want to declare some income of the past which has escaped assessment and sleep comfortably for the future. I have just a few brief points to make. At the end of the day, what is it that we are discussing? I'm quite conscious of the fact that India is still one of those societies where paying tax is not exactly a very exciting or a popular proposition. It doesn't happen in many other developed societies of the world. In fact, if you compare our taxation rates with developed societies, and we can't be boasting that we are the fastest growing global economy for the last 2 years, hopefully for the next year also. And we aspire to evolve from a developing society into a developed society. We can leave out tax havens, we can leave out areas in the Gulf or Singapore. And whether it's Japan or it's China or it's Australia, Western Europe, North America, you can compare our taxation structures of direct taxes with any of these countries, and most of these jurisdictions, you will find corporate tax a little more reasonable, but the highest slab individual tax ranging from 35–40% upwards up to 54%. And gradually over the tax reforms which have been made by successive governments, our slabs have become more and more reasonable. As far as corporate tax is concerned, we've attempted to become globally compatible, and I've already announced a roadmap that we will come down to 25% minus all exemptions. If we look at the larger public finance in India, I'm not going into exact figures, but if as an approximation we take it, we get about 8 lakh crores from about direct taxes, almost a similar amount from the 3 indirect taxes, that's customs duty, service tax and central excise. I've been asking this question both to the CBDT and the CBEC, that if evasions did not take place in India, what would this 8 lakh figure be? And what would be the, similarly in the indirect tax figure? I'm not going to answer the question, but each one of you, without disclosing it, may answer this and put an approximate figure in your own minds. What does that eventually lead to? Even by squeezing expenditure, as against this amount, 15-16 lakh crores collected, our expenditure is upwards of 19 lakh crores, closer to 20 lakh crores. We borrow, leaving the next generation in debt. And then manage the governmental expenditures. And if you are asked to give, devoid of taxation issues, your opinion on what our real economic challenges and problems are, each one of us would answer the obvious. We still have a sizable section living below the poverty line, so you need money for social sector schemes. There is gross inequality between rural India and urban India, so you need urban-like infrastructure in rural areas. You need to invest in human resource. You need to invest in infrastructure as a whole. You need to spend on healthcare, on education, and various social expenditures. And then you can take a final call. If many of us did not indulge in this evasion, would India have the resource to spend where we are not spending? The obvious answer is yes, and probably we would have a surplus. Now, this is where the country stands today. It depends on various factors. And at the end of the day, if you take a revenue neutral situation, it's unfair to tax people to collect more than what is necessary for running the country. So you must have an optimum collection which is adequate to run the country. You shouldn't tax people more, because excessive taxation can also lead to unfairness on the citizens. And therefore the figure must be a figure which at the end of the day is based on revenue neutrality. That when you are shifting from one taxation system to another, so that deals with indirect taxes, but for the purposes of the expenditure of the government and the tax devolution which goes from the central government to the state governments, if we need that figure of revenue neutrality as also the trend of increased expenditure and increased collection, amongst many factors that would impact the arithmetical calculation of the rate, one of the key factors is the higher the number of exemptions, the higher would be the standard rate. And accordingly, the higher the amount of evasion, the higher would be the standard rate. So you can't speak in terms of a moderate rate and indulge in evasion at the same time. Evasion will lead to a higher rate. And the good thing about checking evasion is that when we are even shifting from one system to another in the indirect taxes, the ability to discover a direct tax income of the department would also increase. And technology has become a big facilitator. And therefore, as we advance over the years, not only is it morally, ethically correct to pay one's taxes, it's also safer to pay your taxes. I find that whenever a scheme of this kind comes up, in order to not accept the scheme, several suggestions are made. And fortunately, the department and all of us have gone through the experience of having dealt with all those suggestions. If I recollect correctly, when the former president, Mr. Venkatraman, was the finance minister, he came out with a scheme in the early 80s. That for every 10,000 rupees of black money you deposit, you will get 12,000 rupees back. After a certain number of years. So people suggest you actually have a scheme like this. And about 800 crores came into that scheme. It was a disastrous scheme. That's the entire amount came. And I've heard a large number of suggestions asking me to abandon the IDS and come out with a scheme of this kind, which was tried and tested. Even the 1997 scheme, probably brought with the best intention, had many issues. And we were now conducting a post-mortem of that scheme last year. So you make a disclosure, you pay your 30% tax plus surcharge, if any, that was applicable in 1997. And you could disclose if you had some asset on the 1987 value. So declare it on the old value. And that is, I think, the suggestion CBDT now also gets almost several times a day. When finally the scheme was over, some very interesting conclusions came out. The first conclusion was that over 90% of the declarants were either housewives or minor children. Actual cash was not disclosed. Either money is invested in immovable property or fictionally into jewelry, and the 1987 values got declared. So the scheme was used for a purpose. And some good and honest taxpayers went to the Supreme Court and challenged the scheme. And I personally believe it was a very sound challenge. And they said, I paid my taxes from 1987 to 1997, and I paid 30% or 40%, whatever was the applicable rate each year. Now the tax evader has been told that you pay 30% on the 1987 value. So the evader gets away by paying some 15 or 20%, where the honest man had paid 30 to 40% each of the years, the interest factor notwithstanding. So the scheme is a discrimination against the honest taxpayer, because you've given all kinds of incentive to the not so honest taxpayer. In any case, the scheme had worked itself out, so the hope was then expressed that such schemes would not be repeated. And that is why the 2016 scheme, we should be very clear, is not an immunity scheme. The fact that instead of 30% you pay 45% means you are being asked to put and pay even some token penalty for not having paid your taxes in the past. Otherwise, if you factor in the interest you have saved on the past taxes which you didn't pay, it will will be a repeat of the vulnerability of 1997. And there ought not to be a scheme which should incentivize in a manner that it creates a discrimination against the honest taxpayer. Because as more and more people are paying taxes, the honest taxpayer should never feel that I get discriminated against as against a person who indulges in evasion. As I mentioned, it's a citizen's duty to pay his taxes because it's a part of his patriotic duty. The state has to run on taxes. There are many concerns which had been raised, and the CBDT has more than adequately clarified that there is a complete confidentiality. In fact, this fear was spread when under the black money law for assets held abroad, under the 2015 legislation, we had opened a compliance window. Now, all those people, some 600 to 700 people, who made disclosures are today sleeping well. And subsequently, details have been coming in about those who didn't avail of the scheme in 2015. And it's absolutely clear that with each passing day, the world is becoming more and more transparent. That iron curtain around the banking secrecy in tax havens is being demolished. The G20 initiative, the impact of the FICCI law in the United States, the cooperation between one country and another. Information now is getting available even on a real-time basis. And cases have come to light of those who had assets abroad and didn't make a disclosure. And now at various public functions of this kind, I find one or two worried people walking up to me and said, "Are you going to again open a compliance window?" The answer is no. The law has to be complied with. After all, we can't make a mockery of the whole process. And therefore, those who didn't disclose it during that compliance window must pay for the consequences. And that is precisely going to be the case as far as domestic assets are concerned. It is not that the revenue network will not be aware of what's going on. And because of the first question which I asked each one of you, requesting you not to answer the question but to keep the answer in your own mind, each one of the steps that the government is taking is gradually at the end of the day intended to culturally change the way we think and to accept the fact that the payment of taxes is a part of my statutory and legal and ethical obligation. And therefore, each one of the steps which we have taken, and some of them do face resistance, but I have not the least doubt in my mind that as generational changes are taking place in India, we also know the way our next generation is behaving in acting. And therefore, the faster we are able to move in the direction of an ethical spending culture, I think the size of our economy, the ability of the economy to generate more revenue, our ability to spend more on development and growth of this economy, the ability to service the weaker sections a lot more, each one of these would get increased. And therefore, our journey towards making this country economically more prosperous, with better infrastructure, with better rural India, with lesser, if not by eliminating poverty altogether, which is a great challenge, by providing ideal healthcare and education. I think the faster we realize that these are important national obligations, it will be good for us individually, it will buy us peace, we'll sleep well, and certainly collectively it will be a great opportunity for the country as a whole. Thank you very much.